I'm very pleased to be here tonight and hear what I've heard, see what I see. I pray the Spirit of the Lord will help me to remember the events that transpired during the raid time. Uncle Fred asked me if I would tell from one of the boys' perspective of what things looked like. And since he called me, my mind has just been swirling with trying to remember what went on. And every person that went through that raid had a perspective to tell it from, all very dramatic. And it was trying to think back now. I think that and I've not only think, I know, I've heard Uncle Roy refer to it, would go down in history as one of the greatest miracles in the history of the earth. In listening to Governor Howard Pyle's speech the morning after the raid, after they had locked all the men in the schoolhouse, and listened to the governor come over the radio and tell what he was going to do, and all the steam they had up against this little body of people, it isn't hard to see now that it certainly was a miracle indeed. But at that moment, it was very sobering. My first recollection of what began to take place and the dawning on me that we had a very serious problem on our hands was when Uncle Roy called the meeting in the middle of the night. There may have been some rumors, a few going around, but I think there was some evidence there might be a raid of some kind. Nothing real concrete. But as the night of July the 26th, 1953, we had a big celebration that day. For the 24th of July, or the day before, now the 26th of July would be on Sunday. But we, over to Uncle Lewis Barlow's home, he had fixed up an old radio with some of the help of some of the young boys in school. And we were trying to monitor the situation to see if we could tell just what was happening. But Uncle Roy did call this meeting, and many of the people from, all that could come, came over to this meeting. And as you've heard, Grandpa Jessop, in his very definite way, dedicated the people to the Lord. Uncle Roy spoke to the people, Uncle Rich spoke to the people, Uncle Carl spoke, and it was interesting, as been reported, about the eclipse showing up. And the thing was delayed a little while, and the people went home. But Uncle Roy had sent some of the men out on the highway to see if he could tell just what was happening. And some went out to the Berry Knoll way, and some went out the other way. And in that day, there was just one old dirt road come through town. And they had taken dynamite with them out to, if the thing actually showed up, they would set this dynamite off to alert the folks at home in town. And after a while, this dynamite began to go off, and it was shattering to the nerves. We little realized what was actually taking place, or at least from my perspective, from us young fellows. It was very exciting and very, very sobering. We could tell by the seriousness of Uncle Roy and the brethren that this thing was a very, very serious problem. Well, the thing quieted down a little bit, and I laid down on the lawn in front of the schoolhouse because it was getting to be way into the night, 2 or 3 o'clock, as I recall. And all of a sudden, burst into the crowd came Dan Barlow, who had been out at the Berry Knoll. And this lineup of cars had come with their lights off from both ends of town, and they had come in and and stopped. And I guess they were trying to decide what to do. But Joe Jessop and a fellow by the name of Charles Jensen, Chuck Knudsen, a bunch of them, and Dan Barlow were out this way of town, and probably many others. But Dan had crawled up to the side of the road where he could hear the officers talking. As soon as felt like he could tell what they were doing, why, he slipped back away and run from the berry knoll to here through the sagebrush and the plowed field right down at the old schoolhouse. And he was just totally out of breath. He could hardly gasp out the words that said they were coming. They were coming in. And I had laid down there for a minute and fallen asleep. And when he burst into the crowd, and just at that time, over the hill came the screaming sirens and the red lights flashing till to describe it, I felt like all hell had broken loose. It just a screaming bunch of demons coming in. And it came from both sides. And a little before this, the dynamite blast had gone off. So we were well alerted, but it was just a whole lot of not knowing what was really coming to pass. So we stood there, the group of us, in the schoolyard, and as the vehicles come swirling into town, and I remember Frank Porter, the sheriff of Mojave County, in one of the lead cars. About the same time they came by, Uncle Roy stepped out of the crowd and hollered very loud to them to halt. And I don't know whether they heard him or not. The sirens were screaming and everything happening. But I always felt like that they would yet have to answer for not obeying this prophet of God who was shouting this command. It really impressed me at the time, and I've always looked forward to the day when they would have to answer for that. But anyway, Frank Porter leaned out of his car and hollered as loud as he could holler. Everybody stand still, nobody's going to get hurt, and so on and so forth. The cars pulled up to the fence and stopped, and the officers jumped out and surrounded the group. Some of the outstanding things there was men like Grandpa Jessop. Of course, you have to realize all these officers armed with their guns out, and they didn't know what to expect. All they had heard is this was a bunch of wild desperados up here, and they were coming up to quail an insurrection against the state of Arizona. And I don't think they really knew what they were getting into, but they came prepared, as law officers have to do, to meet the issue or do whatever they had to do. So they were very, very jittery and very jumpy. And the press was there, and light bulbs flashing, and it was the old days where they had to spit out the light bulb and lick the other one to put it in real fast. And you could stomp on these light bulbs and they'd sound like a gun, which us kids delighted in doing after we calmed down a little bit, but it kept the officers kind of nerved up. But Grandpa Jessop said, if it's blood you want, take mine. And it was just, the air was so tingling with, I don't know, I can't find the words to describe the situation. And Uncle Roy repeated to them that the sand would drink our blood before we would give up our principles. And it was touching then, and it's touching to me now, and I'm sure to you. But I remember some of the other fellows. Spencer Johnson he looks like and is a mild-mannered fellow, but under those conditions, he could speak quite straight and forceful to those officers. And I would say he was like white hot. But anyway, as the morning wore on, we had the Sheriff Nyborg with all their lights and everything, pointing out who was who and what was what. And Don Covington was there, and they were telling the officers, giving the officers the information on the men so they could arrest them and put them in the jailhouse, which that morning would have been our priesthood meeting room. And they made that into a jail, and that's where they were putting them as they were finding the men and arresting them. And the officers, of course, were assigned in many different areas. Each of them had an assignment, as Aunt Margie said, to a home. Attorney General's assistant named Paul LaPrade. He was a very young fellow. It was dusty, and this day, very dusty, and he went around with his pant legs rolled up, and like a real smart aleck. To those of you who remember, that description fits him very well. But one occasion that morning, he came up to me after it got light, and you could see what was happening. He asked me my name, and I told him, and he repeated right back my father's name, my mother's name, my brothers and sisters, all of them, and where we lived, and so on and so forth. He had it all memorized. And I suppose he had the whole town doped out in about that fashion. He was a very brilliant young fellow and must have had a good memory. I can't vouch for anything else. But anyway, as the day wears on now, they're taking this man and then that man and the other man and locking them up. And some of us were in and around the building and where the men were held, and Uncle Charles Zitting was there. And he called to some of us and asked us to go up across the creek and find Dan Jessop, Joe Barlow, and Jack Cook and tell them and bring them over and have them to turn themselves in. And so we quickly went and found them and told them. And they quickly came over. And Sheriff Porter it's pretty well after they had everybody rounded up. Sheriff Porter had men searching for these fellows, and that was the only ones left he didn't have. We were walking up to the jail to speak to Uncle Charles when Uncle Roy looked out the window and saw us coming. And he said in a very stern and loud voice, says, "You guys get out of here and get back across the creek." So Joe and Dan and Jack turned right around, went right back, got in the car, and zoom, back across the creek. And just as we were getting in the car, Sheriff Porter said, "Who are those fellows?" And they were stirring around there, and in their frustration and confusion, why they got away and back into Utah, they didn't catch him. And Uncle Carl, in particular, had some fellows working up in Hatch. He was in charge of the work projects, some down at Middleton. I don't know whether it was this day or the next day. He asked me to go up to Hatch and find the fellows, tell them what happened, and to bring most of them home. And on the following day, he asked me to go down to Middleton and do the same thing, which I did. But in the process of going to Hatch, I don't know why, but I went around by Fredonia. And over at the old Pipe Springs watering trough, those of you who are old enough to remember, there, standing up on the trough, is Judge Faulkner. And we stopped there to get a drink, and he was there getting himself a drink. And it was, I guess, his first trip coming into town. And I remember him eyeing us over and looking at us, and I didn't even know who he was. But it was just an interesting event, and whoever was with me, we went on to hatch and got the fellows and come on back. But through the course of events, and on the first day, being Monday, it's hard to get all this to come together in the proper sequence. They were going to haul all the men off to Kingman Jail. And they were trying to gather up all the married fellows. Somehow they got Wayne Hunter in there to boot, but didn't hurt him, I don't think. Anyway, the realization that they were taking Uncle Roy away, and all the men, our fathers, everybody of a responsible nature, was kind of serious. However, we knew Dan and Joe and Jack were still up in the hills. They had been up looking for him. So the men went on to Kingman and went to jail. Now us fellows who were home, we felt like there were serious problems, and under the direction of Dan and Joe and Jack, we were moving people around a little bit across town. In one instance, Aunt Cleela Johnson had a baby over at Arizona, and somehow she was over in Utah. And they didn't like the stirring around going on at night. The officers didn't. And they put out word, or put out a curfew. And it sounded pretty serious to us. All they said they were going to do is anybody caught out could be shot. And I don't know that we knew the whole meaning of that, but it sounded serious. But we smuggled Aunt Cleela across the creek and down the back roads, and they happened to see us down here on the South Road. And we had to get through a couple of fences and across the road. And Aunt Cleela was not feeling all that well. And I remember the panic that went through me, because here come the officers, two or three cars come rushing down there on something they thought they had seen. And we just had to drag Aunt Cleela under the fence and hide her behind a pile of weeds, and we all laid there flat as we were. But the car pulled right up to the weed pile, and its light shined right over the weeds, and they didn't even get out of their car. They just looked around, couldn't see anything, and away they went. Well, talking about it from here doesn't sound too bad, but right then it was a very serious occasion. But we were able to get Aunt Cleela back to her home, and then I think it was on a Wednesday night, the time Aunt Lydia's telling about on the Utah Exodus. The word came from Dan and Joe and Jack that all us young fellows needed to make our way up across the creek, but we were still under this curfew. And Ray and myself and Skippy Carlson were trying to go from our home up the way, and we'd sneak across when they weren't looking, and got out here behind Lee Beislein's home. And someone had piled up a big pile of dry tumbleweeds there. And the officers saw something going on they didn't like, so here they come with their lights flashing and their spotlights. And it's kind of humorous now, but Skippy Carlson didn't know what to do. I got there in a hurry and burrowed into the weeds, but he had to just plow into them, full steam ahead. He dove into that old pile of dry tumbleweeds quick enough that they didn't see anything. They just come, looked around, shined their lights around, and left. And this is real combat. I'm just trying to think of it later on tonight, but we thought we were doing big things, and I believe we were. But we made our way up across the creek to where the fellows were gathering up all the Utah people to try to get them out of the country, because The fear was that the Utah side was now going to come in and raid Utah and haul all the folks there away. So Aunt Lydia told the story about us crossing out across the reservoir, and everybody was carrying somebody, and it began to rain, and we were trying to keep all the kids from crying. And I was back along the trail with the cedar bough trying to brush over the tracks. And all of a sudden I heard something coming up through the trees, and I thought the officers had us again. But there was John Reed. And I didn't know whether I was more scared of him or the officers at that time. But we looked at each other, and he said, "Well, what can I do to help?" And in a little while he was out along the trail packing, bawling kids and back and forth. And I thought that was really something for this guy, because we grew up a little bit scared of him. And anyway, that part of it worked out. We got out to the old road, and that was before the trees were all railed over. And somehow Aunt Rhea Coons got in the picture and got her son John Coons out there with his car, and we were trying to get the people out to where Gerald's truck could come in and pick them up. The connections didn't quite make it, but we did manage to make 8 or 10 trips, however many it took to haul that many people in an old car. But when you're really cramming them in, you can get quite a few in. But it was raining, and the road was full of mud puddles. And John Coons was a wild driver. And we just crammed people in there, and then I'd jump on the back and ride shotgun. And he'd go through those mud puddles fast he could go. And half his head like this was just solid mud. Because the windshield was so splattered, he couldn't see from. He looked like he was half Mexican, but I was on the back, and I got the whole shower. And I don't think they wanted me because they thought I was all Mexican. But 2 or 3 times he hit bumps so hard it dumped me off, and I went rolling down the muddy road, and he picked me up on the way back. But after we got the people all down part way and let them off to where we hoped the truck would come in and get them out to somewhere, like Aunt Lydia said, we didn't really know what we were doing. But that was an all-night project, and we had been up night and day, and we were getting pretty weary. Anyway, a bunch of us ended up clear down there somewhere halfway to Hurricane, and now we had to walk back home. And we got, of course, stayed off the road because it was heavy traffic and the officers were coming and going. And I remember getting back up near home, crossing the creek, and laying out on the creek bank because everything had been happening so fast and you hardly had time to settle down and think about it. But I was just really weary and tired, and I remember laying down on the creek bank and looking up in the sky. And this was like 10 o'clock in the morning. And it didn't seem like until then the real impact of this thing really settled on me. And I just could sit there in a daze trying to understand and appreciate and realize what was happening. And as we were saying, the morning before, or the 2 or 3 mornings before, the governor was telling the world about what he was going to do to this people. He's going to put the men in jail, put the women in jail, and adopt out the children and destroy the record. And that was coming across the radio just like if the governor was to come on now and tell the people about something he was doing. It was just like a matter of fact. And they had us bottled up and had the men down in Kingman in jail, and so on and so forth. Well, the week wore on, and they would bring some of the men up, fly them up from Kingman to court. Now, Judge Faulkner was here, and Judge Lorna Lockwood, who was a sheriff or a juvenile judge from Phoenix. Judge Faulkner was the Superior Court judge from Mojave County. And he had been after this people, I would say, for many, many years. He had something to do in the 1935 raid. At least he was around, and he did not like the people here. One of these days, through this week of the raid, seemed like it took a month to get through this week. Up at Lorna Black's home, I don't know why I was there, but I was up there, and Judge Faulkner was there. And he left his briefcase, the pouch briefcase about yay thick, with all the documents that he had, sitting there on his front of the car. And he went into the house and left that briefcase sitting there, nobody around. And from that day to this, it was only my good honor that left it there. I looked at that thing and I thought, I wonder if I ought to take this. And yet I thought, well, that isn't hardly right to take somebody else's stuff. Had I had just a little more experience, I believe I could have talked myself into it. But I had a feeling it might have disrupted their program a little afterwards. But the seriousness of this thing began to gel when, well, let me back up a little bit. The morning that all these police cars come into town, the National Guard and all their battery of vehicles come in right behind the police. And they set up big tents, as you were told over here in the field, and all the mess gear to feed the whole community and so on. It was just like the Army had moved in. There was tent after tent after tent. You may have seen the pictures. And that's where they fed the officers through the week, and the people that wanted to go there, and some of us young fellows who liked to eat made good use of it. But we began to get acquainted with some of the officers. I remember one officer from Phoenix. His name was Larry Dugan. And it was when they were packing up to thinking about leaving. They had ordered the buses in along towards the end of the week. And this fellow I'd got acquainted with, and he came to me and told me what they were going to do. And the darn guy began to cry. He had tears in his eyes. He said, if I'd have known what I was getting into up here, I would have never, ever come. I'd have quit my job. I'd have done anything. But I'm sure these officers began to see that they weren't dealing with what they had been told. And many, many of them went back ashamed of what they got involved in. And so it was a kind of a turnaround. But as the men came and went, they'd fly them in, have court, and fly them back to Phoenix to jail. And as the week wound down and they had their hearings on all the men, then they were going to have to, and the bond was raised for them to get out. The state and the officers in charge, Attorney General's office, knew, I feel like they knew that they couldn't let the men back home without doing something with their families. And so they ordered in these buses. We're going to haul them off to Phoenix. And all day Friday, they tried to load the people, and the rains would come and bury those buses in the sand, just undermine them and sink them clear in the mud. They'd get them out, and a little while another little storm would come and do it again. And I think they panicked a little over it, but Sheriff Porter come and found me, and so did Sheriff Nyborg. He said, Uncle Roy, and that's what they called him. He said, Uncle Roy wants you to get his car and David Broadbent's truck and come to Kingman and get them, because they'll be out of jail. I guess it was Saturday. But they were having trouble getting these buses loaded and getting the people in and gone. They had the folks lined up along the old school, along the sidewalk there for all of them, in preparation to loading. And me right then, and all the kids younger than I they were taking. And the reason they didn't take us older fellows is one word that we got is that they was afraid we'd make too much trouble for them. And there were some needs around the community. They were humanitarian enough to leave some there to take care of things. Well, that was a pretty heavy-hearted occasion, because as soon as I left, I knew they were loading them and going to load and leave, and just did not realize what might become of us. Well, we loaded the car on the truck and left, and got over to the bridge, and the officers held us up, wouldn't let us go. And we sat around there and waited around and waited around and waited around for hours. And I didn't really realize at that time what was happening, but they couldn't, every time they go to load the buses, it would rain and they'd sink them in the sand again. And they didn't want to let us out of town and get on our way until they were sure that they had those buses loaded and gone. Because they feared very much if the men came home and caught them there with taking their families away, they would have some problems. So they held us up until they felt like they had plenty of time. And finally we got on our way, and they were waiting down at Kingman trying to figure out what had happened to us, and finally rented a truck from one of the county Congress people, I think by the name of Earl Cook, who was a friend to our people, about the only one. Him and Jim Smith befriended our people who were in the state legislature. But we finally met them at Henderson, and I think Orville had to climb out. They were in a van truck, and whoever was driving it didn't see us, and we went by, and we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know they were coming, so we went on down the road, and Orville had to climb back up out of the back and up over the cab, as I recall. Maybe that's a tale, or to get the truck stopped so they could turn around and come and catch us. But it was a grand meeting. We all told each other what was happening and got in David's truck, and Uncle Roy had his car there and headed back. We got back to Las Vegas, and sure enough, generator went out on the truck. So we were up all night, the rest of the night, most of the night, trying to get the truck fixed, and finally got back home just at daylight in the morning. And as you've heard, it was a real sight, where they come in and took the folks out with just a little notice. And in some of the homes I went into, trying to help tidy up and get things straightened around, the bread was still in the oven, the fire had gone out, the washing machine sitting there with clothes in it. That's the way you found it, just like the day was going on and the people just left. And I recall Grandpa Jessop coming home to the children missing, and it just literally broke his heart. And I'm certain had a lot to do with his early passing. And I happened to be up at Hilldale when his ire was up a little bit, and he did not appreciate what the state had done, and he was saying a few things about what he'd like to do. Uncle Fred and Dad were standing there, and I don't know who else, but I remember Uncle Rich saying, "Vengeance is mine, and I will repay, saith the Lord." And it stuck with me, and I'm sure it did with anybody that was there. But the raid time and the experiences of the people ought not to be forgotten. Like I said before, this is a very dramatic experience for every person that was there. And we ought to keep telling this story and telling this story, that our young people do not forget the miracle that this people went through. It's as important to us as the children of Israel in any day and age. And the miracle just as great, I feel. I'm grateful to our Father in heaven that we're here and we have this opportunity and that we're going on, and pray that we can all do our part in it and that the Lord will be justified in fighting our battles. We have another battle now that we need the same kind of faith and energy to accomplish the Lord's purposes. And it's interesting to note in the 1953 raid and the people that were taken away, not one apostatized or went away. They all came back, every person. And Aunt Margie's experience with her daughter Susan was the one situation that related to the raid that was a very precious time. I remember the time and going through that and watching Aunt Margie and Uncle Carl endure the hardships of what they put them through, and it was very touching to us all. But I pray the Spirit of God to be with us and that we'll press on in the work, and I do it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.